Thank you, Derek. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited today to have here Professor Jonathan Simon. It is fortunate, but unfortunate that it's so timely, the topic, if I may put it that way. Professor Simon is a professor of law at UC Berkeley. His expertise is in the field of criminology, criminal justice, law, sociology of law, and phenology. He has written several books that I recommend you to read: For Discipline, Governing Through Crime, Mass Incarceration, that we're going to discuss today. And a very exciting, at least I'm very excited about this new book about punitive myth. What I want to say is that his work is beyond criminal justice and law. It's very interdisciplinary, you know, drawing from sociology, economics, history, political science, and philosophy. He not only looks at what is going on right now, but he does a genealogy, very Foucauldian, but a genealogy of why it is we are where we are, in a way that is not inexorable, but how, you know, the distinct elements, you know, came together. And he also looks at the narratives that sustains, you know, our criminal understandings and organized knowledge that we have. You know, in a nutshell, you know, he exposes the injustices of the justice so that we can make justice all that it can be and must be. So it is my pleasure to have you here, Jonathan Simon.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and you've just lent my thought more coherence than it has ever had in my mind. So I hope this is being recorded. I need to write this down later. But I'm honored to be with you today, and it's humbling, I think, to talk in these times. We are in the midst of really grave times, and I know many of us are feeling that maybe things are opening up and all in terms of the pandemic, but we can't understate what we've been through and those we've lost and those who are still suffering. And it has an extraordinary impact on all. I think it makes our speech, you might say, more consequential, harder, more difficult to engage in, perhaps because of all the things that make us want to crawl under the bed at times, but hopefully more consequential because we can imagine beyond our current present, maybe with more force.
Yes, I wanted to say actually in introduction that I forgot, but you, as we say, you know, in soccer metaphors, I know you like metaphors and I like soccer metaphors, right? You left the ball, you know, bouncing, that, you know, you look towards the past in a genealogy, but as a way of looking towards the future. So you know, we are in that watershed today, and your books speak to that kind of like in between, you know, as Aaron would put it, between past and future. So let me start with $1 million kind of question. There's an essential irony, right, in the US. For me, it's like a constitutive contradiction, not between being the land of freedom and equality, and at the same time, the land of incarceration. I think that the statistics are like 5% of the population of the world, with 25% of the carceral population, correct me if I'm wrong. And at the same time, you know, Black and Latinos make up 59% of prisoners, and they make up 25%, you know, of the population. So if you can please talk about, you know, these contradictions, right? Like at the same time, you know, the most kind of imprisoned population, so the less free, and at the same time, the most unequal, right? Because it's an incredibly racialized criminal system.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, it covers some of where I feel like I'm still learning this late into my career, because for a long time I looked at this, as you note, I'm sitting in Bentham's Panopticon, or at least a knockoff of it, and thinking about Foucault and other influential genealogies of the prison that point out that there's really no contradiction between the liberal ideal of the individual subject and the prison in its at least idealized form, because it's all about making the individual accountable in some ways to justice, which was a dream of the liberal reformers really across the globe in the 18th century. Today, I think we have to see the prison, especially the American experience of the prison, much more in terms of our history of being a settler colonial society. I know that's kind of a frightening term for a lot of people, but it just is about our history. You can't really appreciate our history without recognizing that every step of it was shaped by the process of settlement, conquest, displacement of indigenous people, including here in California, where a very bloody history unfolded after the Civil War, during the Civil War, in some of our most treasured landscapes. And now, of course, and then slavery, which even at the time, Tocqueville visited America and commented both on our prisons and on the strangeness of our being the most liberal democracy and the most oppressive country when you considered our slave territories. We've had this problem from the beginning, and in some ways, I mean, Michelle Alexander is not wrong when she talks about the new Jim Crow, and we can relate it to slavery as well. There's always been an aspect of our penal system that protects the equal dignity of the white settler community by excluding from it or providing an internal containment of those that are deemed a threat to it.
Yes, and Elizabeth Hinton actually builds up on that and says that it's not only kind of crime, the danger, but poverty, because you also have the property, white, men added to that. So how did we get to mass? How did we get to mass incarceration? You trace it, in a change of well, not only, different elements, but in a change of penology, of like different philosophies of punishment, of the criminal subject, of the purpose, of punishment, together with political consensus and very strong metaphors that organize the way we know and we practice in society.
Yes, and here I think even since I've written the book, I've been broadening my historical framework, but let me see if I can simplify it at the beginning. It's I think there's a story of both the recent past and the deep past here. So the story of the recent past might be enjoyable to people on this call because it takes us to the 70s, the 1970s, which in a lot of ways I was very young as a trailing baby boomer. I was just entering adulthood. Some of you may have already been adults and part of the generation that was protesting and doing other things. The 70s, which is not as celebrated as the 60s, but it was very consequential, I think, especially for the way we do punishment and carcerality for a few reasons. One, American cities were nearing the bottom, you might say, of a process of emptying out their value as industrial hubs and all that meant from essentially the late 19th century through World War II, but which had quickly begun to dissolve after World War II, leaving a great deal of poverty, a great deal of blight in American cities that we had to cope with. It also was a time when most of our modernist beliefs in the ability of a kind of imperious state to sort of solve people's problems, whether they wanted them solved or not, whether that meant locking them up in mental hospitals for being prematurely feminist housewives in the 1940s or 50s, or queer, which was, routinely people were incarcerated for being queer in the mid-century. So we believed that we could actually force people to sort of become normal in a very authoritarian way, and for good reasons. Many Americans of this generation on the call rejected that vision of the state and demanded a more essentially democratic treatment of people. But that took away a lot of our confidence that we had a way to solve problems like violence. For a long time, we thought mental health, compulsory mental treatment and removal from society of people we thought might be dangerous through mental treatment was the way to deal with that. And again, we had then a storm of violent crime in this period too, for reasons we can talk about, which have a lot to do with both the emptying out of our cities of stabilizing qualities and also the disinvestment in mental health treatment that is pretty well-known story now. So for all these reasons, the 1970s is kind of a perfect storm for basically a country that should have been getting rid of its prison system and rethinking much about its carceral system. Instead, we kind of fell in love with the prison all over again, now on a new rationale that while it couldn't change people, it could sort of contain a generation that we increasingly felt was a sort of, we use the term, I say we loosely, but I mean, politicians used the term super predator a lot in the 80s and 90s to talk mostly about young men of color in our big cities, but it kind of expressed this new sensibility that we were faced with an extraordinary wave of crime and that we didn't have any of our modern tools, or we didn't believe in them anymore. Even policing actually had lost a lot of its promise that it could prevent crime in this period. So I think all of that led to mass imprisonment becoming a kind of surprise winner. I don't think anyone in the 70s thought, oh, what we're going to do right after disco is mass imprisonment. It would take actually another decade for it even to be visible. And it wasn't exactly what anyone wanted or planned, but it is what happened. We can come back to this if you want, but there's a much deeper history that I think I didn't pay as much attention to because, like a lot of criminologists, I kind of assumed, well, look, since prison population goes up very dramatically after 1978 or so and departs from any historic norm by, you know, the early 80s, whatever happened had to be something that happened proximate to that, namely in the 70s. But if you start looking at our longer history, what I think you see, and we can come back to this, is that everything that made mass imprisonment possible was sort of laid down by earlier historical tracks where we sort of demonized aspects of our population and relied more on our carceral system to sort of secure our social order at various times in our history in ways that haven't always been realized in their most destructive forms. And I think that's what happened essentially after the 70s, is that capacity sort of built up over the decades, and in some cases centuries, was sort of weaponized in a way by the federal war on crime, which, as you mentioned, Elizabeth Hinton sketches so brilliantly in her book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime.
Yes, I mean, what is interesting what you say is that it didn't have to be that way, but at the same time, all the elements were there, present for everyone to see that it could very well lead that way, together with, if I may say, also, I mean, we've discussed this the other day, you know, like a society that relies on individual responsibility and individual morality. And once you have the two together, you know, those who cannot make it economically because they were not provided structurally the opportunities to do so, immediately are those, you know, who fail, and therefore those who are potentially kind of dangerous. Like, it comes from the both ways. So what is incapacitation? I mean, how do we get to that term? I mean, you sketched it, and what is total incapacitation, and what does it mean, right? In terms of humanity, it's going to come, you know, crystal clear. But you've done a lot of, you know, philosophical, not only legal work on this issue.
Yeah, it's another kind of child of the 1970s. Some of you will know that going back to the 18th century, we've had some kind of pillars of our penal philosophy that express our aspiration to have a sort of rational penal system that helps to reduce crime or restore the victim. So we talk about retribution. We talk about, which is the society's, you know, just pursuit of some kind of recognition of the harm that has been done by a wrongdoer. We talk about deterrence, trying to prevent crime by making people believe that there will be consequences. We talk about reform. Incapacitation is actually a late comer to that party, and it was never particularly, especially in the extreme way we have come to practice it in California and more generally after the 70s, never really the banner under which any great philosophers have flown. because it's a pretty despairing view. What it basically says is, if we can't really change people by putting them in places like the panopticon behind me and socializing them, we can't deter other people by scaring them. And by the way, when they built buildings like this in America, on the outside, they were made to look like fortresses and dungeons so that people would be really scared of them and would communicate that. Again, if we can't do that, maybe at least we can prevent crime by taking people off the street and putting them in a place where the violence that they potentially will unfold will happen, if at all, only inside this place of supposed greater security. And notice that when that combines with the very despairing view of crime and urban insecurity that we talked about a minute ago with the super predator myth, right? Then you get to something like total incapacitation. Historically, incapacitation had been selective. That is, let's pick out either people who are super likely to engage in crime. And originally, that we can talk more about this later, that was born out of an important influential idea of eugenics and biological criminology, that some people were born criminals or much more likely to be criminals, and that we could sort of select them out of the population and use habitual offender laws to keep them locked up. That was kind of but that was supposed to be selective, or based on a persistent career of criminality, we decide that somebody is going to continue committing crimes. What happened after the 70s is this belief that we had this unusually large generation of so-called super predators who were not only going to commit a lot of crimes as long as they were free, but they were never going to change. And that's where you got to things like giving juveniles life without parole sentence, which is, talk about inhumanity and irrationality. So, let's talk about why this is inhumane. It's inhumane in the most essential way, because the one thing we know about human beings is that they change. It is an essential, maybe a core feature. I don't know if some pre-Socratic Greek philosopher can be attributed this view, but the ability of human beings to reinvent their own meaning and to create meaning is a source of potential for change. And it goes right to the heart of what makes us human and what retains the humanity we retain in us from fairly early to very late in our days. And this total incapacitation view sort of disregards that on several levels. It treats people as if they were zombies, that they're just an unchanging threat, when in fact, we know from a century of criminology that people actually change rapidly, and that the high crime years in almost everybody's life are confined to a decade or two between 16 and 26 or so, unless you do something to extend it, like lock them up and take away any chance they have for future employment, for instance. And it also denies humanity, because what does it take to keep people in prison who have little or no chance of ever leaving? You can no longer rely on what penology had relied on since the 19th century, which was the promise of an early release. If you behave, if you do the things that you need to do to show that you're ready to reintegrate society. If you say, well, we think you're radioactive, we're going to keep you here, that's a pretty good incentive to become part of a gang and do whatever you can to make a life tolerable in a place that yields very little humanity. So this is where we ended up with the shocking reality in California, where we had literally over 200 imprisoned people who were part of a lawsuit who had been incarcerated in solitary confinement with no contact allowed except for, through slots for over a decade, some of them for over 20 years. And the state settled that lawsuit, but has still a long way to go in delivering on sort of unpacking that very inhumane system.
What you're saying, it strikes me that, I go back to the founding principles, alleged founding principles of the US, which is the land where you can reinvent yourself over and over and over. I mean, and total incapacitation is the absolute opposite of that kind of permanent possibility of change and reinvention, right? I mean, it goes, to another of the tension. You worked, I mean, I want to ask you so many things, but one is, these, total incapacitation and the growing population, in particularly in California, that actually multiplies, and in a way it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of problems, right? In terms of extending the age, extending the time, decompensating the chronically ill. Is a true humanitarian crisis in which, you know, people are denied their juridical persona, their moral persona, and as you said, you know, their spontaneity and subjective persona. It's like a pure denial of humanity.
You know, I couldn't agree more. And there's sort of two faces of it that are a little bit different, but both speak to the essential inhumanity. One is the excessive number of people who are suffering from persistent mental illness, who have cycled through our jail and into our prison system, who are then put into solitary confinement as a form of management, basically, by a system that doesn't have answers and can't deliver care in an effective way. And that is, I think everyone would agree, torture. I mean, when you're putting somebody who's suffering from symptoms of serious mental illness, leaving them untreated in a place that is going to exacerbate every aspect of their symptoms, like total isolation. And it's been held to be torture over and over again by our courts. But remarkably, here in California, you will still find mentally ill people. And this is something locked up in solitary. And the Inspector General has issued a number of scathing reports to the state about that. The other face, though, is this idea of managing what we call gangs, or the prison system actually calls them inmate threat groups. What they are is essentially, and this is something that is well known in South America, where you're from as well, which is inmates who are put into a situation where the state is not actually providing the resources or the security to have a livable life inside the prison. They only maintain control of the gate, basically. And so it becomes essentially almost a principle of fundamental human dignity to organize yourself in a way that allows you to have some life. And so what arises is gangs. And we can talk about why they take the form of racial gangs in California. It comes out of our history and our colonial history very much. But the bottom line is, many of the people that have been held and are held in solitary, and in many people suffering these long sentences based on the 3 strikes laws as well, are identified by the law enforcement system as gang members, as if that again proved that they were zombies that can't change. Well, these zombies organized a hunger strike in 2013 that eventually had 36,000 imprisoned people in California refusing meals, one of the few things to look forward to in any carceral setting, for days, and in some cases months, and had negotiated a peace agreement across the racial divide in a space where they were supposed to not be able to communicate at all. So sort of extraordinary resilience, but they don't look like they're being tortured. And in the book, I use a phrase that people on the call will may remember. It's for younger people, it doesn't really exist anymore. And that's the idea of, I call it torture on the installment plan, that it's not like somebody can look in the window and see you writhing on the floor in pain or symptoms. These are resilient human beings that if you spoke to them, you'd be amazed at how they've held it together, how they've maintained body and soul. But they have to do it by overcoming sort of pain on a micro basis every minute of every day.
Yeah, and what you point, you know, in the book as well, is like this kind of split. First of all, the disregard of the individual as an individual, and I don't know whether this is your idea that you developed, I think, in the 90s, of actuarial justice, but this like neglect, you know, of the individual, and within that neglect, it's kind of split, you know, between the subjective, the human, you know, subjective, and the bare life, you know, what Agamben calls the homo sacra, the bare life. But it's not even that bare life now that is even respected as a body, right? And is this relating to the, if you can talk a little bit about the progression also of cases? I think it was Brown versus Plata. I'm so bad with this.
Right, so, you know, California is a unique place, and maybe the only place in the country that could have created this tremendous Supreme Court case called Brown versus Plata, which I thought was so important. I wrote a book about it. I was a little optimistic in expecting it to become better known, and the publishers were wise to convince me not to use the title, not to use the case name in the title, because people still haven't heard of Brown versus Plata. But it really was very important. The reason, because it ended, in effect, mass imprisonment in California, forced us to take a lot of steps, not enough, but a lot of steps to move toward much less reliance on imprisonment, in particular, incarceration in general, as we had been. And it took literally 20 years to get there through a heroic battle of imprisoned people who became the class members for a series of class actions that really, in a sense, flipped this total incapacitation institution in a way that maybe exposed its only weak spot. And that is because a lot of what made total incapacitation viable, even though it was costing California billions and trillions of dollars, is that people felt that it was sort of unavoidable, right? If you have toxic waste, then you're going to spend what it takes to keep it out of the water supply. If you have a population of people you describe as zombies who will be attacking citizens or invading their homes if they're left in the community, you will support probably very harsh policies, even if they cost the state a great deal. And that's where we were. And it was very difficult to disprove it, because when people left prison, they were often so damaged that, or they were treated with such suspicion that they quickly went back to prison, usually for minor things. But it sort of reinforced the impression that we were dealing with an especially dangerous population. But what happened is that the state had become so convinced by its own myth that it designed and built prisons as if it was zombies being held there. And zombies don't have mental health problems. Zombies don't have physical health problems. They're already dead. So they don't have to worry about deteriorating like the way the rest of us have to fight that, especially in a prison setting. And so they built prisons more than any prisons in our history, I think, outside of the South, perhaps, that were intentionally designed not to recognize even the human frailties of people that they then planned to warehouse for much of the rest of their lives. So this created a legal opening in what was becoming, you might say, a prison of the Constitution itself. Because in 1995, and I think he'll still have to answer for it someday, Bill Clinton signed what was known as the Prison Litigation Reform Act, right? Not the Prison Reform Act, but the Prison Litigation Reform Act. And the conceit behind this bipartisan bill was that clever prisoners were tying up state prison systems in court by misguided judges that were giving them sympathetic treatment, and that was blocking the effort of citizens to incarcerate as many people as they wanted. So this law essentially created all these barriers, as if barriers didn't already exist, to imprison people getting heard by a federal judge, which, as you can imagine, is not easy to do to begin with. And as a result, successful cases even getting to court sort of fell off the map beginning in 1995, creating a situation where we were essentially mass producing constitutional violations and taking the one institution in our society that had an obligation to listen to those and do something about it out of the game. But these imprisoned people and the lawyers that they were able to draw to their cause saw the potential vulnerability in this. And that is, if you are creating a situation where you're systematically denying people a constitutional right, and the courts had long held medical care to be fundamental, if you're going to lock somebody up, take away their self-care ability or their family care, you've got to make sure that they get care. Otherwise, it is torture, it can become torture. They realized that this kind of a challenge, if once established, would put the state in a position where if it could not fix that problem, because of the fact that they had designed this inhumane system and were systematically overcrowding it, there was no way California could actually deliver on fixing the problem. Eventually, even under this very harsh constitutional prison, the law would allow a court to not only question the lack of health care, but actually question the population, which is the key to ending mass incarceration, is to putting caps on the actual number of people you can hold.
And that's what happened together with this opening, as you mentioned, in regards to the Eighth Amendment, right? If you can tell, what the Eighth Amendment is and how this would open a window for what you are, calling, if I understand correctly, like a new common sense stemming from this ruling, a kind of a path of opportunity to change, right?
First, on the Eighth Amendment, which, as you probably will have heard at some point, includes the Eighth Amendment includes a ban on cruel and unusual punishments. And for a long time, some justices believed that only was a bar to torturing people literally, as was done in European forms of execution in the 18th and 19th century, breaking on the wheel, other very torturous forms of punishment. In the 20th century, the Supreme Court recognized that imprisonment, even though intended to spare people that kind of torture, could in fact become tortuous if people were locked up without necessary resources. So imagine that you're locked up and then no food is given to you, and your family's not allowed, as they are in Latin America often, to come in and bring you food. You will soon go through an experience that will be very much like torture, pain unto death. Same with medical care. So the courts had long held that a system had to provide that. What was novel in this era and really showed the nature of mass incarceration for what it is the courts had not held before that sort of a systematic lack of provision for that could become a system-wide violation. So it's not just a case of these individual prisoners have had their rights violated because they didn't get the surgery they needed, but that as a whole, the system was operating in a way that was inevitably going to lead to some of its prisoners, some of its imprisoned people being exposed to that. So that's what was kind of novel. And Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, called it the most radical legal theory used in a prison case, in American history. And in some ways, he was right, because it essentially recognized not any particular prison or even a particular prison practice, but a systemic problem, this overpopulation of prison people and lack of provision for the humanity of prisoners was leading to a systemic problem that needed a systemic solution. The reason that it also helped to point to what I think has actually gotten stronger as a new common sense, even as maybe the legal foundations of Plata are now a little bit precarious with Justice Kennedy having retired. He's the hero of my book, having been the one conservative justice that joined the majority. He's a Californian, so we can take some pride in that. But the court, in order to get to where it would allow this population cap, not only had to show that there was a constitutional violation going on, not only had to show that the prison overcrowding was the main thing preventing it from being fixed, but they also had to show that it would not cause a significant increase in danger to the public to cause this population cap. So that it forced the court to actually ask itself, well, what do we know about the crime prevention benefits of cycling lots of people who are mentally and physically ill in and out of prison? Does that help a system to control crime when we release people, or when people aren't sent to prison? Is that likely to lead to an increase in crime? And they brought experts in that talked about all the things that the state could do, including more effort at rehabilitation and reentry, but mainly pointing to how people did change in prison, and that there were a lot of people who could be released at very little risk. So I think that helped, because again, this core to the old, what I'm now calling the old common sense, it was new in the 70s, but like a car from the 70s, it's getting pretty rusty by now. That old common sense had at its core this basic compact that the state can make you safe by taking these super predators out of the community and keeping them locked up, no matter what, no matter how bad it is in there, no matter how little we do for them. The late George Deukmejian, who was governor of the state and helped to lay the foundation of mass imprisonment. He's a person who came to see some regret in that, I think, later. But he famously gave a speech during one of California's periodic overcrowding lawsuit problems, where he told the legislature, it's better for the state to have a problem housing criminals than for citizens to have a problem with a criminal in their house. And that kind of trade-off, right, that any prisoner that leaves prison is somebody who could be in your house burglarizing it, created this sense that anything done would inevitably lead to more danger. So this new common sense, which we've actually been living with for about 10 years, and we can talk about whether the recent spike in violent crime because of the pandemic should make us reconsider it. But basically, we've been running an experiment since 2011. The state has been living with about in the neighborhood of 50,000 fewer people, fewer citizens in prison than it was, say, in 2006, 2007. And in some ways that went down even more during the pandemic. All that happened without either, first of all, a giant effort to do better helping people in the community. There was some, but a lot of it was just, we're not going to send these people to prison for minor violations or to jail. And by and large, it's been intensively studied. You can visit the website of the Public Policy Institute of California, a public interest research foundation in San Francisco, where they've closely tracked this. And they show that while there's some categories of crime that have gone up, and you may not be surprised if you live in San Francisco, auto burglary is #1. If you've maybe seen some broken auto glass on your sidewalk or even had your car broken into, it's extremely frustrating, but it's not the kind of thing that convinced people in the 80s to do mass imprisonment, this fear of zombies invading their home, because they weren't locked up in prison. Crime stayed very low. Violent crime until the pandemic was at its lowest rate overall in California since the very early 90s.
Is that breaking actually that consensus that was shared between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals about crime in terms of the function and the purpose, and whether the actual, the prison is fulfilling, the purpose or public safety or is not? Because it feels that we're at a window of opportunity where things can go either way. And I'm going to then ask you about, where we are now and how you see, Black Lives Matter. But if we can talk about it, particularly in California, which seems to be like the bluest of states, but the bluest in terms of sadness, vis-a-vis the mass incarceration as well. It's like a walking contradiction.
Very much. And, I think I have waves of optimism, and we can talk about the difference that the Black Lives Matter movement is making. I think there are a number of factors that are playing in here that I think increase the chances for a kind of transformative shift in the way we imagine crime and imprison people more generally, away from this zombie super predator model. And so criminology, my discipline, which has usually played a pretty bad role in providing ideas that reinforce public fear and often falsely create a sense of expertise on the part of law enforcement that they actually don't have, has actually contributed here with two very important bodies of criminology that I think are maybe going to be as influential over the next few decades as the kind of super predator criminology was in the 1980s and 90s. One is this very old idea of life course criminology, the idea that most people are super predators at 17, whatever that means for them. It might mean smoking pot out behind the school if you're in a very privileged space. It might mean being a gang member if you're in a more dangerous space. But the point is, and criminology has always known this, if you prevent people from falling into lives of crime or of criminalization between the ages of 16 and 26, basically you've solved the problem. Most people after that, they can solve their own problems within the context of work life, family life, community life. If, however, you let people become deeply alienated and even really increase their trauma by putting them in prison, all bets are off. As you've noted, as a country, we've always done a very bad job of looking beyond individual responsibility to provide forms of social security. President Biden is going to be talking in a few hours about a new era of care. I think there's at least a possibility we could talk about from the carceral state to the care state. It could have problems too, but it would make a big difference in building it around, especially youth and children. So life course is very important. It also means that we could take the tens of thousands imprisoned people here in California and across the country that are 50 or over, that are facing a real possibility of dying in prison, who are costing us a lot because getting any kind of health care to them is very expensive. And we could find a humane way to return them to the community now at virtually zero risk because what we know about their age. We should for both practical and humane reasons. The other important form of criminology that is helpful in thinking about this is what we call situational crime prevention.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've always known that certain kinds of situations create much more ripe opportunity for people to be tempted into crime or make victims more vulnerable, make it harder for people to intervene, to prevent crime. If you want to talk about why crime shot up so much when I was a teenager in the 60s and 70s, a lot of it had to do with urban breakdowns that led to basically a lot of criminogenic situations, right? Dangerous situations where the fabric of the city had been torn up and no new structures had been put in its place. So when you begin to think about criminology that views the individual not as irrelevant, not as a machine that's being driven by factors beyond our control, but think of the individual so-called offender more as a person in a rowboat out on the bay when it gets really windy and stormy. Yes, what they do, what they choose makes a difference, but it's only a small part of an algorithm in a way that's going to determine whether crime is likely. And we can do so much more to prevent those crimes, not by focusing or obsessing on individuals, but instead by focusing on those situations, right? Take that tragedy on New Year's Eve in San Francisco, where a DUI driver killed two women crossing, I believe, a Mission Street on a very wide intersection. He turned out to be somebody with a long prison record and who could have been locked up on some parole violations. And it became a kind of a moment of anger and questioning of our effort to move away from incarceration. And yet that turns out to be one of the most dangerous intersections in San Francisco. And how much more would we have gained from creating, truly protective road crossings there and narrowing Mission Street so it's not a super highway through south of Market, that have nothing to do with trying to change somebody who's been damaged by years of going in and out of prison and could be helped, but probably not just by being thrown back into prison.
Yes, the interesting thing is that the situational crime, the research that you cite about crime being way more situational, that if you want ontological, right, defined by the mere fact of being a particular kind of racialized criminal subject, that actually requires a more sociological and structural, approach to crime that goes against, foundations of, individual responsibility of this country. So on these narratives that are foundational, I would like to move to, you're writing now a book, or you finished the book, and I'm so grateful that you shared not only the first chapter, but a blog that I'm going to share with the audience about, what are the narratives? Because it's not only that we have institutions and that we have kind of political ideologies, if you want to call them like that, or partisanship, but there are also kind of founding myths, right, that organize the way we know and the way we practice, and we're willing to legitimize and allow, and that these myths that you call myths are related to certain arches, right, of transformation in society that start to make more ergonomic the acceptance of this kind of criminology.
Yeah, it's one way to understand. One way I can frame this project I've been working on is it's an effort to make amends for and to contest with the maybe over-optimism of the book that I shared with you and that we've been discussing, which seemed to make it seem relatively easy for us to move away from this very inhumane reliance on over-punishment. And I'm afraid it's going to be hard, partly because our history doesn't create just kind of one determining influence like slavery or like Jim Crow or like eugenics in the interwar period that has shaped and influenced our punitiveness. It's done it over and over again in ways that create don't replace each other, but often reinforce and collaborate. And we have formed what I consider almost a kind of state religion or civic religion around punishment. And here we're not alone. The state is a quasi-mystical idea, right? It comes right out of the theological idea. I mean, they weren't real subtle. The king is God for the secular terrain. And what is the equivalent of the Bible? Well, law, and particularly criminal law, which is often seen as the king's unique, control form of law, right? So we have this, what some political theorists would call a political theology of sovereignty that's long been associated with the state. What political theorists often forget is that that wasn't the end of this sort of creation of a kind of a theological confidence in the state that has been reinforced by ideas about crime and punishment. Because as the state has grown over the centuries, and as it faces new demands to play a role in securing the social order that's disrupted by various changes in economics, et cetera, the criminal legal system has been sort of the core part of the state that it usually feels that it can have legitimacy to use. And so we've gotten repeated efforts at, in a sense, expanding the carceral or the penal state, giving it new institutions like the prison and the police that were not part of the original idea of sovereign justice, or in the 20th century, like parole and probation and the juvenile court, which were actually part of what we call now the eugenic era, when a certain idea about scientific racism and the causes of crime being genetic, or they didn't even know about genes yet, but hereditary traits led not only to sweeping changes in our immigration law that excluded Europeans, most Europeans and Asians from even coming to the United States, but also a concerted effort to weed out the population of effectively of born criminals. So as I see it, we've got a series of myths about crime and about the ways in which punishment make us a stronger, safer, more virtuous society that act as a kind of permanent tailwind behind the idea of punitiveness or expanding the carceral state as a way to solve our social problems, and makes it very difficult for reformers, let alone abolitionists, to actually change anything without putting in place some new form of punishment to address that sort of almost religious faith, right? And I think America has a particularly strong version of this penal religion for two reasons. One, we've always relied more on a commitment to the idea of our state as a kind of special state. We sometimes call it the city on the hill. That's what President Reagan liked to call it, which has often been used to justify our imperial interventions around the world, because we're, after all, there. God made us in charge of trying to fix all those problems. But also this idea that our state has sort of unique powers to address social crises, but especially through these punitive means. And so we've always had a strong, what some sociologists call civic or civil religion. And I think it has a particular punitive bent, especially because of eugenics. Again, it's one of the ideas that I didn't know about when I wrote my last book. Mostly, I wasn't delving yet into that history. It shows how much one still has to learn well into one's career. There's some great books about this. I recommend Khalil Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, which is very helpful in seeing how, when the immigration restriction laws of 1924, which would have prevented people like my grandparents, Eastern European Jews, Italians, Slavs, other not quite white enough Europeans, were cut off from coming to the United States. And it went from a gusher to a trickle in 1 year because of a law. It was really one of the most revolutionary legal changes we've ever had. That was also the time when the Great Migration was bringing Black Americans, essentially an internal migration, up to the cities from the South. So very quickly, the face of crime went from people like my father, Russian Jews who were crowding on the Lower East Side, et cetera, to the face of a Black person, became the face of the born criminal. And even though eugenics became controversial and then ultimately rejected because of its association with Nazi atrocities during World War II, this belief that we have a hardcore crime problem in our cities and it's mostly associated with minorities, remains very strong here. And again, very few other countries took that turn. I think that really helped to weaponize our penal system for eventually what we got, mass incarceration.
Yeah, and then eugenics, I mean, if I understand correctly, because of the conditions in which mostly Black, but not only, were found vis-a-vis crime, this kind of statistical discourse became kind of a principle of attribution of being, right? Like there was like kind of this movement, you know, very dangerous movement. I have so many more questions. I wanted to talk about legality and dignity, but I'm going to focus on two very important things because I want to be fair with the audience and I want to encourage the audience to send the questions via Q&A. You mentioned, since you mentioned your grandparents, you know, Eastern European Jews, I want to ask you, how is this moment different from other moments in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, the new ideas about abolition, and the Chauvin's verdict?
Well, I'm gonna have to change my background just for a second because, you know, in asking how it's different, I think, you know, we can talk about different moments of history. I think one moment of history, again, that this people on this call will recall, 1968, the year that this police riot in Chicago, my hometown, happened behind me, is a reminder that almost all the things that the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for, a reckoning, as they rightly put it, around the nation's violent history of white supremacy and racism, a reconsideration of our over-reliance on punitive institutions like police and prisons, particularly because of their impacts on Black community, a true reckoning with poverty in American society. All those were very much on the table in 1968. My parents were dyed-in-the-wool lefties who believed that Bobby Kennedy might bring a transformative presidency that would move us rapidly in that direction in 1968. Instead, he was murdered in California in, I think, May or early June of 1968. By the time this scene unfolded behind me, the chances of a transformational moment toward racial justice were quickly becoming the war on crime. After all, Richard Nixon won the election that this battle in Chicago was fought in the midst of on a law and order ticket. And if you add in the voters for George Wallace, it was a very considerable majority of Americans. So what's different about that time and this time? Why didn't we tend to do the right thing then? And why might we now? I think there's a couple of things that are really noteworthy in addition to the absence of the Vietnam War, which I think had a very destructive impact in terms of the level of violence that it was kind of promoting in American society and dysfunction. One is the enormous change for good in the diversity of our voting public. I mean, in 1968, something like 70% of the voters in America were white. And a big plurality of white people were basically racist, not just implicitly, but in their explicit belief systems. And again, talking about eugenics, you know, today we look at college educated people as some of the most in front of support for Black Lives Matter and racial justice. The truth is, it was universities like Berkeley and Stanford and Harvard that promoted eugenics. And basically, if you got college educated before basically the 60s began to change things, you probably came away more racist than you would have been without college. So there was a lot of what W.E.B. Du Bois would have called the veil that laid over American society's racism that just was unseeable, even with King and his movement, even with the Black Panthers. The other side of it is, I think when you look at the long genealogy of Black-led liberation movements and Black movements, they've always been profoundly important to deep changes, especially in American society, beginning with the Haitian Revolution, which really transformed in many ways the United States in all kinds of ways that sent ripples that we continue to live with in many respects. 68 was another moment of global Black-led liberation movements and demands for a reckoning. I think what's interesting when you read some of the histories, and there are great histories of, say, the Black Panther Party and other leaders of that movement is, and we should never sit in judgment of an earlier period because time is history and history is history. It is what it is. The nature of the global Black-led movements in the 1960s were basically the independence movements and national liberation movements outside the metropolitan homelands. And the model of being a revolutionary was not going to work, essentially, for Black liberation in the United States. When you watch the new terrific movie about Fred Hampton, Judas and the Black Messiah, and Hampton was a potentially transformational figure. He was murdered by the police a year after these events. In one of the funnier, kind of awkward moments of the movie, he's yelling to a church full of people, I am a revolutionary. Say it after me, I am a revolutionary. Well, you know, it's a spiriting moment, and you kind of hear what he's saying as, I am a transformationalist. But they were fitting themselves into a model of Che Guevara, of the Vietnamese Liberation Front, and that was a pretty hard sell as a coalition building move in metropolitan America. Today, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a deeply American movement, it's a movement built out of American Blackness, I would say, is for the world in some ways the model. People in Africa, people in Europe, in South America are talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd, as definitive of the forms of oppression and white supremacy that they experience as well. So I actually think this is a really exciting moment where what W.E.B. Du Bois was dreaming of over a century ago, a kind of Black consciousness-led reconstruction of American democracy, has a much better chance than it did in 1968. And hey, a lot of us thought it could work in 1968.
And that generational kind of change that you pointed to, and the green light of academia at the time to let this thing go, are two, you know, a path of potential change. But you also point, you know, somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, that you know, Black Lives Matter could be signaling like the two of the vulnerabilities that you see in the myth, even though they're very, you know, self-reinforcing. And the other thing that I find fascinating, and you may want to address, because you mentioned COVID, you know, at the very beginning, is that the Black Lives Matter, not only does it kind of set a strategy and a strong kind of statement, but they also make visible the invisible. And not only that, what together with Say Your Name, but not only that, the fact that massive movements came out in time of high pandemic infection means that their lives were already under that high a threat. That actually the pandemic may symbolically be worse for other people, but for them, I mean, maybe I'm overreading into this, but that's how I read it. It's like, this is how we live all the time.
I think that's so true. And a lot of the, you know, I think we have to always be what I think Gramsci called it, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the heart. You know, we have to be looking at the hard restrictions on the transformation that we're trying to make. But we also have to have deep sources of optimism, and the Black Lives Matter movement is that for me, for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not alone. As Elizabeth Hinton's new book, and forgive me for not having the title of it, it just dropped, I believe, in publishers, but and Google it, you'll find it, looks at the long arc of Black liberation struggles in America after the 60s. And in a lot of ways, if you look at the places that are leadership places of the Black Lives Matter movement today, places like my hometown in Chicago, they never stopped, right? I mean, Fred Hampton's death was a punctuation point, but it wasn't the end. It was a permanent struggle. And what you begin to realize is that for some of us who have the privilege of whiteness or straightness or age and middle classness at this point, for me as well, it may seem that the carceral state, the penal state, and its kind of violent nature is something that comes in and out of focus. It was in focus in '68, and then it went out of focus. It never goes out of focus in Black communities, right? So they have a permanent need to change it. And I actually think this is going to work to our advantage as our cities are now becoming populated by younger citizens, more racially diverse citizens. And a lot of our carceral policies and penal state institutions are state and local institutions, right? Electing different prosecutors in San Francisco, very soon, I hope, in Sacramento, possibly here in Alameda County, can make, in LA, where George Gascon just got elected, can make a huge difference. And this is where the Black Lives Matter movement can have the biggest immediate impact is in these local races where we have diverse communities that are listening. The other thing is that while all of us who have been inside the privileged space of whiteness or felt welcomed in it, and of course that extends way beyond people who have phenotypically white skin, it is a kind of space, I think, of white domination that means, that goes beyond skin color, right? The White House is a white institution, even when a Black person happens to be sitting in it. Universities are white institutions, even when they have more Black faculty than they used to. For those of us that have been inside white spaces as an insider, the temptation, going back to these myths we were discussing, is always there to believe that while we haven't done it right up till now, there's some way that a harsher form of justice or a new and improved form of penal justice will somehow solve the problems that we're never going to run out of. We're going to have people harming themselves with dangerous drugs, people using guns, as long as guns are very prevalent, and they will be. And we're going to have that temptation, and it's something that Black communities don't have. And that's the last point I'd make is, for a long time, people who supported expanding the police and the prison system had an ace card in the idea of violence, that violent crime is so bad, so terrible, that we can't afford not to have the police and prisons and long prison sentences especially. What the Black Lives Matter movement is showing us is, for the people who are actually exposed to the most violence and the most interpersonal violence, as well as state violence, this has never worked. The carceral legal system has never worked for them. And if we had more time to talk about the history, I mean, one of the reasons that that mythology has been built up is that the institutions we've created, think about the police, aren't particularly well designed to prevent violent crime. How could they? They were designed to protect property against looting and theft. And they can do that when they're not generating or provoking the looting reasonably effectively. They really can't do much to stop people who have weapons from harming each other. And there's some limited exceptions to that. But I think the myth that law enforcement is an answer to violent crime, and that's what we're hearing now, that we've gotten a surge of violence during the pandemic. Some people saying we have to go back to being tough again. Well, it didn't work then. It's not going to work now. Let's talk about what we could do.
Yes, that's an answer. I want to encourage the audience to ask questions, because I have, a lot of questions. But that's another. I don't know whether I call it a myth, but the expectation that more of the same is going to lead to change. I mean, it doesn't seem to go away, right? It's like crime or police, as opposed to, I know you're a Foucauldian, right? And I actually found out that you actually talked to him when he was in Berkeley. I'm envious, if I may say.
Why we come to Berkeley, you never know who you will meet.
Exactly. But it's this idea of I don't know how it's translating in English. Actually, in French, is penser autrement, right? Like to think differently, to think in a different way. I mean, I don't know how it was translated into English, but I mean, this is the moment of opportunity of thinking about. I know you work on ideas of abolition, and the fact that abolition doesn't mean we get rid totally of prisons, but that there are gradations in sentencing. There's a redistributive justice, transformative justice. I mean, I don't know where you stand in all these kind of different lines, but abolition means we need to think about this problem completely different, right? Including the police.
And this does come back to my favorite, has long been my favorite concept, and one that I think I see more clearly now than when I wrote the book, and that's human dignity. It's human dignity that Justice Kennedy invoked when he condemned California's prisons as unfit for civilized society because they ignored human dignity. And it's human dignity that we hear in the voices of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's human dignity that brought millions of Americans actually into the streets after George Floyd was murdered. I mean, notice that it wasn't just the extinction of his life, which happens all too often to Black men in American cities. The way it was done and the public nature of it was an additional sort of affront to human dignity, to the human dignity of all those people standing there and the whole community of people who were basically being shown contempt by Derek Chauvin's unwillingness to even consider for a moment George Floyd's humanity. So I think there is this powerful clarity about human dignity that we're seeing now in negative through the treatment that the police do. We were sharing the other day our admiration for the Israeli philosopher Margalit, who talks about not a dignified society so much as a decent society. But what he says is a decent society is a society that doesn't humiliate people with its public institutions. And he had in mind sort of the way that communist states used to sort of humiliate people by making them confess and do things of that nature. But if you look at the carceral state in America, it humiliates people of color all the time. You probably haven't experienced this if you're white, but being frisked or put up against your car for things that really contribute very little. So there is this idea of human dignity that's been percolating in the West for a long time. I think it's gaining great force. Look how big a role it's played in the movement for same-sex marriage and LGBTQ plus rights more generally. For an aging population, its dignity has special meaning because it brings into scope the value that humans have at every moment in the life course, not just when they're having kids, not just when they're productive for the labor market, is very important to how we're thinking about dignity. The fact that we're having older society that I think can appreciate that more than perhaps in the past. But what that has not included up till now so much is the victims of the penal state and the carceral state. And that's why this Black Lives Matter movement, because it's once again reminding us that our sense of human dignity is all too often color-coded and color-blind in a way that leaves out Black experiences. And you mentioned COVID, the high burden of COVID death and suffering that Black and Brown communities are suffering is almost like a public lesson in structural racism and sociology, public sociology, you might say. So that's another reason to feel that there's real education going on. I'm a teacher, so maybe I overestimate the learning that goes on at moments of public education, but I think there is, something's happening. What would Dylan say? Something's happening, but you don't know what it is.
Yes, I mean, that's the window of opportunity, because I mean, dignity brings about kind of, I think that you trace it also to the Judeo-Christian tradition, together with kind of the due respect, the more aristocratic kind of Latin meaning of it. But we are all due respect, right? And this respect could very well be interpersonal, but that's a more difficult thing to achieve. But at least at the level of institution, it has to be afforded to each and every individual, regardless of socioeconomic status, race, etc., etc. So how do you see, I mean, in at this point, that Chauvin's verdict, if I may, because he was also put in solitary confinement, and, you know, I had trouble actually understanding, I thought about you, that I would ask you, I had trouble understanding whether this would come, you know, from like a more widespread idea of dignity, or, you know, as a reactionary actually measure because he's a police, right? With all the privileged treatment that police had in the past. What's your reading of it?
Interesting. Well, I did want to insert, in terms of, you know, another reason to see the kind of dignity discourse that we see now in the Black Lives Matter and related movements is it's coming from both, not just Black people, but Black women, queer Black women, trans Black people, queer Black people. Traditionally, dignity has been very white, and it's often associated with figures like Immanuel Kant, who were explicitly racist and imperialist in their views of the world's non-white people. So it's very interesting to see how it's being reimagined by people who don't have any reason to identify with that tradition. In terms of Chauvin, I mean, you know, one comparison to make would be, you know, it's maybe unfair to Chauvin because we're talking about a masculine, but you know, I would like to have a penal system where I was confident that Derek Chauvin, now that he is a prisoner on his way to being a prisoner of the state of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota, I'm sorry, the city of Minneapolis, could be guaranteed that his, you know, time being serving a sentence would be one in which he would be constantly surrounded by efforts to conserve his human dignity and protect it both from attacks by other inmates, from potential damage from solitary confinement, etc. You know, if you want to see what this looks like, Norway's treatment of Anders Breivik, the right-wing mass murderer who killed like 83 teenagers at a summer camp, and
Mm-hmm.
also dropped a bomb on the Parliament building in downtown Oslo, I think killing 9 people there. So somebody who probably wouldn't have survived even to get back to the police station in America. Not only, if you look at him throughout his trial, was he clearly treated with total respect for his human dignity. There's not a mark on his face that you can see anywhere. But he ended up suing Norway in the human rights courts, arguing that even though he was essentially in what looks like a dorm room at Stanford, he was being isolated from other prisoners while being allowed to study at the University of Oslo. And they actually thought they ruled in his favor. I haven't followed what happened next. So I would love to be in that kind of system where we were talking about, is Derek Chauvin's isolation going to go on too long? What can we do about it? The sad thing is we're a long way from that. I obviously don't think Derek Chauvin should be the first in line for the restorative justice moment. But again, as soon as they put the handcuffs on him in that picture that you can see, I immediately started to worry about him as a human being. What's going to happen to him now? And I've heard that exact same thing from Black activists, that the moment they saw the handcuffs go on him, they felt some concern for his humanity, because they know too well what it can mean to go past that wooden door in the courtroom to where they prepare you, for being incarcerated. The other thing to really keep in mind is, while this verdict is a good sign of a cultural change that in the past allowed juries to just look past the facts, by no means is it going to produce the kind of transformational change in policing that we might want, right? While the trial was going on, Black people were being killed by the police. Even since he's been convicted, they've been killed by the police. Only changes in policing can change people getting killed by the police. And you won't get that by punishing the odd case that is so clear that that juries are willing to do it.
Yes, I mean, I agree that there are practices also that, as long as they're allowed to for police to use. I mean, there is this split second also Supreme Court ruling that gives a lot of benefit of the doubt. And actually the video, the 9 minutes, I mean, it's undoubtedly kind of like, even though it's not intentional, it is intentional. I don't know what the legal figure is exactly, because I'm not well versed, in these things. But as long as you have that only as an exemplary case, it's gonna leave the barrel untouched. And I know that you like metaphors, and that you've used, the metaphor of the bad apple and the barrel somewhere, I can recall, right? So what are the reforms that you would address, like the ideal kind of maximum reforms, or the gradual ones that can be done right now in order to further prevent these, encounters in which there is that creation of the split second scene, and we know how that ends?
I mean, I think there's urgency to be had in trying to change policing right away, to try to prevent Black life from being taken. And what we know is that you can't do that at the point of lethal force being used. For the reason you're suggesting, the law very much favors the officer's perspective when they're in a situation that may be dangerous, even if they created that situation. And what I have been saying recently is, if you want to make Black Lives Matter, the only change in policing that will really make a difference would be changing their power to control the lives of Black people. They have enormous power now to stop any Black person they want in a car or on the street and force that person into an encounter that may end in lethal violence if that police officer then decides that they're in danger, which we know can happen very quickly. And I'm talking about things like no more police stopping automobiles on pretexts like a sticker being out or a taillight being out. Unless the police have reason to believe that this driver is a danger to traffic safety, no stopping, send them a ticket if you think that they violated some technical rule. Or if you have probable cause that they've committed a crime, then stop and arrest the person. But often police use this as a fishing expedition. That's what happened to Dante Wright. Undoubtedly, that training officer said, I'm going to show these young officers how you do it, how you stop a Black person, see if they have drugs on them, see if they have money they can't explain that maybe we can seize and keep, see if they have a gun, which will become our justification for having this. So these kinds of situations are easy for the police to do. They serve very little function to really prevent crime. The most that you can say is that they might take some guns out of the system, but we know that guns flood the system, and it doesn't seem to make very much difference. And they come at a huge cost of racial indignity and injustice. So I would stop that right away. It seems to me what police should do is essentially respond to calls for serious crimes, especially crimes involving guns. Think about the tragedy that happened in Chicago to young Adam Toledo, who was a 13-year-old shot. We should think about why that happened the way it did. But when people call in and say there were shots fired outside my house, you probably want somebody to respond that knows how to use weapons and knows what weapons are about. So I think we're going to need police for some functions, but in the meantime, we should train them not to chase anybody into a dark alley. I mean, the rule should be at the end of your shift, nobody should be dead. That should be rule number one. Even if the bad guy gets away, you know, we get people again these days. It's not like you really get away. So, you know, the rule should be nobody dies on your shift. If anyone dies, we ought to treat it like a plane crash and figure out that somebody's at fault, because this should not happen. So I think there's a lot we could do, but it won't, I don't think it'll affect our public safety very much. And that's the good news.
You know, that's an excellent point. I mean, it's the obvious, right? Like Black Lives Matter. So make sure no one gets killed at the end of the day. I mean, it should almost kind of be conspicuous. And together with defunding the police, if I read you correctly, what you're also suggesting is decoupling the police, namely like single out only the dimensions that the police should and has to fulfill, and leave others, like, you know, emergency calls or social, you know, need to other state agencies. But that would require actually found those agencies. Actually, I have a question. It's very clear that systemic racism is present in the police structure because of the shootings of Black men. Are these incidents happening with white men, Latin men, Asian men, etc.? Or is it just that clear? It seems like it's open season on Black people.
There's no doubt that it's disproportionately. I think the chances of being shot are about 3 to 5 times greater if you're Black than white, and Latinx would be kind of an intermediate position there. And it's almost hard to imagine how that would not be true. We know there's all this research showing that implicit bias, that Blackness now is so deeply associated in American culture with crime and violence that just to see a Black person is to think of a gun, basically, to see a gun where one isn't. And then we've, as I was saying, since the eugenic era, we have tended to emphasize that the best way to control America's supposedly out of control crime problem is to emphasize heavy policing of originally immigrant neighborhoods, now Black neighborhoods, and it's been that for a long time. So that builds up a high racial bias, but by no means. I mean, you know, essentially people of all races die. One of the most dangerous situations, and it'd be really interesting to rethink how we handle these, are essentially calls around involving domestic violence. If somebody calls the police and says, my husband, my partner is abusive, he's beating me, and he also has a gun, that's a very dangerous situation. You're obviously going to have to send a police officer. You're not going to send a psychologist or a social worker only to that kind of a situation. But that police officer is going to face real danger in that situation, because if you're approaching a house and if somebody who's so caught up in toxic masculinity that they're violently abusing their predator, their partner, not their predator, you know, thinks that you're coming in to intervene, they may well shoot you. That's the situation where police are probably most at risk of themselves being shot. So I can't tell you that there's a simple solution to all of these problems. But if we concentrated police on, look, you become the expert on these armed situations and you learn everything you can about de-escalation and about how, but we're going to use other people to handle mental health emergencies. We're going to use other people to address even low-level crimes. I mean, police should not be executing warrants for drug crimes of the sort that led to the death in North Carolina the other day. Why should someone ever die to be arrested for a drug crime? There can be no justification for using the death sentence against somebody who could only have been punished with prison at the most, had he been taken into custody.
Yes. On that note, I wanted to ask whether you wanted to add something that you want to share with everyone. I'm getting like private messages, you know, they're mesmerized. They're saying, I'm a former public prosecutor. He's excellent. And it's so much information, you know, to take in. Is there anything else that you would like to share? I would give you a little homework. So you share with me a few articles. I mean, you sent me the last blog, but if you have others that I can share with the audience, I always try to do that. Any final comment you would like to make?
I just want to give a shout out to my fellow baby boomers on the call, because our generation is essentially the generation that did mass incarceration in some ways. I mean, it began with people who were responding to us in fear in some ways, like Nixon and whatnot. But ultimately, it was support from baby boomers all through the 80s and 90s and aughties that led many politicians to believe that they could never do wrong by being as tough on crime as possible. And I do think that baby boomers have an important role to play in helping to kind of dismantle that system. For a variety of reasons that we don't have time to go into. We came of age in a very privileged way in a lot of respects, in terms of the education system and whatnot, jobs, et cetera. But we also came at a very frightening time when American cities were undergoing really a half-century long remaking that has seen them return in many ways to prosperity, but led to very scary periods where I think people bought into the idea that only a very aggressive penal system and police system could keep us safe. I think there is a rethinking of that. I mean, we saw it literally in real time as Hillary Clinton, who's a baby boomer, began to apologize for using phrases like super predator back in the 90s. And there's been a reckoning with some of the policies that were supported by Democrats back in those days. So I think we have a role to play as a generation. We've obviously left millennials with a lot of tough social problems to solve, and anything we can do to sort of help to dismantle this will be very important, especially because our votes, we get listened to by legislators and city councils and county supervisors. Older voters are very reliable voters. So if you let your supervisors and others know that you really care about ending mass incarceration, really transforming policing, your voice will count.
Yeah, that's a forward-looking point, you know, after this, you know, the justice crying and liberty crying there in the back. So, you know, look at local elections and actually make your voice heard. I mean, we know that those formative years, as you pointed, you know, the political experiences that we have in those years linger with us for a lifetime. And sometimes you have to do like very, very kind of conscious work and effort to change that. So John Simon, thank you so much for being here. It's been an honor and a pleasure. You're a wealth of knowledge. I recommend people to read everything you can find, but the latest stuff maybe more for like more immediate reasons. And he's going to share with me. I'm giving some homework. If you can just share a few articles besides the one.
I'd be very, very happy to. I'll put a little PDF together with links.
I didn't mean to give you homework, but I think, you know, everyone will appreciate it. Me too. Thank you so, so much. It's been, you know, a real treat.
Hopefully next time in person.
Inshallah. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Simon. Thank you, Professor Kolesas. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good day.